Am I good to start?
Yep.
Okay. Today, I will be giving a Rumen PM in your honor, where I will run a bunch of framing, a bunch of weighing, and then only one argument about more investment. Let's start out with the framing. This debate always involves this weird chicken and egg problem where proposition teams claim that the basic stuff is logically prior to the higher level stuff, and then the opposition teams are like, well, the higher level stuff is ultimately more important, and then after you're going to get the basic stuff. So I just want to start out my speech by breaking this deadlock and actually explaining why the basic stuff being prior is substantially more important and the long-term stuff is not actually prior. We think that you need basic fundamentals and infrastructure that are established before you can get investment in people and long-run development that's going to exist. Let's illustrate this in a few basic ways. If you have schools and doctors that exist around a city, but you lack functional roads or public transportation for individuals to travel on, you are unable to access those resources. If you have a healthcare system, but you only have hugely polluted water and individuals keep getting sick, the healthcare system is going to be unfunctional. You need things like basic research system that exists to build upon industry. Basic goods are therefore necessary for the wider ability of systems to be able to function, or otherwise the systems are going to become overburdened, fall apart, or not be accessible for the vast majority of citizens. Now, the response we're going to hear from opposition to this is, but you get the higher level stuff, and then after that you invest in the basic stuff. Our claim here is that once you have the basic level stuff, we're able to still get a lot of the benefits of the higher level stuff without direct degrees of state investment. Let's talk about this both in the context of education and healthcare. Firstly, in terms of education. The first observation that I would like to make here is that not all jobs, in fact, a minority of jobs in developing countries actually require higher level education when we think about the kind of industry that underdeveloped areas are going to be subjected to. It is just not true that we have a financial sector in Lagos, so it's already the most dominant financial sector within Nigeria. In poor rural Nigeria, we're also going to get a financial sector based on things like stigma, like underdeveloped capital, even with education, like long-run payoffs of education. Realistically, then, we're probably still going to get manufacturing or service-based industries that are less dependent on education to function. For example, things like tourism industry, things like service sectors, where you're often doing things like making calls, things like manufacturing and factory work that are still far better than people who don't have jobs under the status quo. Secondly, there's been a massive proliferation of online education that exists, things like online university programs, the ability to learn English, even if needed for tourism, on things like Duolingo, even as a proliferation of Western media. I'm stealing your argument from EUDC, that helps people be able to speak in English substantially more effectively. Thirdly, though, when people get more capital via accessing basic degrees of good, i.e. being sick less often because they have better water, being able to spend less money on transportation because there's more public transportation, in the long run, we can get grassroots investment in these kinds of things. So the debate is not like we were never going to invest in education. It's just about the ordering of the relative processes. I think then that the push for higher level things like education comes after we get the basic things done. On things like healthcare, I would also posit that even if we don't have like doctors, which even without like formal investments in healthcare systems, often still local level doctors are able to take care of people. Resources like healthcare and education can be exported from other areas, not just online, but even if your small town does not have a doctor, once you have roads, it becomes easier to drive to other towns in order to be able to access things like medical care. What then is the weighing of this? Firstly, quality of life is higher because we just allow people to access basic things like clean water by actually having things like functional sewage system that's going to exist. But secondly, we explain why our pathway for growth makes substantially more sense because you need the basic things first. I would posit that also on a piece of weighing here about just like equality, even if they end up getting things like education under their side without the basics first, their system just perpetuates inequality. Because if you have education without roads, if you have education without basic access to water, the only kinds of people that are able to access these goods are those who are in the upper middle class. Whereas if you establish the basics first, access to eventual higher level resources are distributed substantially more equally. And even if you don't buy that the end point is higher level resources that are going to exist, at the very least, our resources are accessible for everyone because you're often public goods. I can access the well, I can access the bridge, where things like education, the individual often still needs to pay for, and the state has more power in making determinations over who gets to access resources. This is my weighing and framing. Now I'm going to go into the Naomi PM of a bunch of mechanisms over how we get more investment under our side of the house. Before that, does BACAP have a POI?
Yeah, how do you guarantee this will actually be good spending and not wasteful spending? Like, for instance, when Kenya blows billions of dollars building a high-speed rail.
Is it easier to see if the government builds a well if I'm getting clean water into my home, if there is a new road, or assess whether the state is investing successfully in education, which will often only have payoffs in 30-year times. There's far more direct accountability mechanisms within our world where like change is just visually apparent versus your investment in vague human skills. Why do we get more investment? Firstly, let's talk about domestic investment. Domestically speaking, companies are likely to be substantially more competitive and face lower export costs are going to exist. Why? Why do you not have functional infrastructure like no bridges, no wells, and no roads? It's extremely difficult to get your goods from place A to B, both in terms of domestic markets in the country and in terms of international markets as well, which means it is harder for like poor MNCs that are trying to build up within these states to be able to compete with other MNCs that have better infrastructure and therefore face lower costs. When you have higher transportation costs, what this means is you often have to price your goods higher because how you price goods are contingent on what your costs are. Because if you're selling goods too cheaply, but your costs are high when it comes to making goods, then you're going to operate at a loss. The issue is that when you are selling your goods for higher prices in international markets, they are fundamentally uncompetitive because Western competitors can sell them more cheaply, even in basic industries like manufacturing. So you need better infrastructure in order to maintain competitive pricing of your goods, which are necessary for these corporations to stay afloat. Secondly, on labor mobility, the better infrastructure that you have when it comes to things like transportation, fewer individuals are boxed into their communities, which often have jobs that are not suited to their actual skills. Substantially more people can transfer between regions under our side of a house, allowing things like doctors to go into regions that you actually need them, people who are good at plumbing to become plumbers rather than random allocations of labor. Finally, most importantly though, on foreign direct investment, FDI or people doing the FDI care substantially more about good infrastructure than good people. For the reason that I gave earlier, they need good infrastructure to remain globally competitive, but they don't really care that much if your people are educated based on the framing that I already gave about how most jobs in these areas are not high-skilled jobs. If they really need to, they can just export labor from elsewhere, and there's still a few people from these countries who go to well-trained universities and who are really, really rich. Therefore, they're substantially more likely to invest when you have basic infrastructure that will allow them to be competitive rather than needing to force them to shield the cost of building them itself. FDI is also higher when you establish more climate resilient systems. We're often talking about areas that are located near waters that are vulnerable to things like flooding, and therefore seawalls are extremely impacted. Why is FDI good? Firstly, job creation. Yes, they're often exploitative. These are people who are starving under the status quo. $5 a month is still better able to put food on the table for your family. Secondly, a larger taxable base. When there's more economic activity, the government extracts more revenue through taxes, better allowing them to reinvest in the people in the welfare state. Even in authoritarian states, there are accountability mechanisms over how tax revenue is spent through things like protest. Finally, strengthening the rule of law. There's often pressure for court systems to have a better rule of law and protect property rights. Very proud to say it's an opening government.
I thank that speaker very much for that fine Roman speech. I'd like to give the floor to the leader of opposition to open their side in today's debate. Here.
Hi, can you hear me? Give me a second. Can you hear me? I'll also try with video. Yeah, hopefully it's still okay. If that changes, let me know. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I've also seen Roman give analysis-heavy speeches, so you can also consider this a different Roman speech. 1, I want to point out that PM doesn't break the deadlock. They're still within the chicken-egg problem, right? Because they just say the systems you build will be overburdened, but this doesn't break it, right? It just tries to prove their side of the house, but saying, no, we have a smart framing. It's not. You just try to argue that your egg came before our chicken. Secondly, they say education is not state dependent. You can catch up on Duolingo and by doing online courses. I think there is an issue of like where the gov case is set. Note, the motion says underdeveloped areas of the state, which means that the discussion is rural Nigeria versus urban Nigeria. You'll never be able to catch up with the educational and the skill standards of people from urban Nigeria by learning Duolingo, English on Duolingo, right? You will always be left behind and you will never be able to compete unless you have direct state investment and state-sponsored education in the areas, in the underdeveloped areas. Because as opposed to urban schools who are already well off or where people are rich enough to go to a private school, here you're fully dependent on government investment to have at least a fighting chance compared to the other country, because to the other parts of the country, because otherwise it's a constant like snowball where you grow more and more behind. Lastly, the rest of the debate will be integrated. The issue with one argument is that it's non-comparative, right? Their way up is having clean water is more relevant than having whatever op is having. I don't think that's true. On a strictly intuitive basis, I'm not sure whether water or having a hospital is a more pressing need. So this means that you cannot just weigh this up on what is the more pressing. People have different like pressing needs. I'm gonna address that in my argument. One, what is the situations of these areas? This is a frame that I think is relevant. One, they're poor, either because they don't have any sort of resources or because they have had resources which have been exploited and now have no economic relevance. This is important because it means they can't naturally create interest for companies or are not naturally interesting or profitable to companies. Secondly, they're sometimes populated by ethnic minorities, which comes in very relevant in the last point. Time frame. One, the place-based investment take a very long time to accrue. This is relevant on two areas. It takes a lot to be built, which means there is a lot of suffering in that window. It takes 10 years for you to build a highway or 5 years if you're a functional country. And in this time frame, you prolong the day-to-day suffering of people who don't have access to healthcare or cannot send their children to school. The second reason why it's problematic is because you don't see the benefits to their day-to-day life even after the bridge is built. It takes another 5 years for people to figure out that they can work in the other market from the other city or to find a doctor in the other city that they can access, which means that this time frame exposes them to day-to-day suffering, but also creates prolonged periods of unemployment and of distress, right? In the period where you build the infrastructure. This is problematic because it means the crime increases, right? In prolonged periods of poverty, crime tends to increase because people need to provide for their family. If you don't do that and you invest in people, you stop the snowball effect of them being perceived as criminal and as being discriminated when they try to go into the urban center. Secondly, it's problematic because the kind of research or green energy things from the info slide have a higher barrier of entry. People from rural Nigeria will never work in the facilities that you bring or will never buy the solar panels that are being produced in their area. But thirdly, even at best, they serve less immediate needs or needs that don't help them uplift themselves, which is something that they intuitively prioritize. Here I interact with the OG frame. What would people prefer? One, I think stuff that gives them agency. Investing in people, giving them education, work skills, give them agency to choose whether they want to stay or to move out or to reinvest their money in something else too. I think they prioritize stuff that empowers their children, right? They're happy if their children get to a better school. They're usually willing to make sacrifices. Thirdly, I think they prioritize more proximate needs, which I do think are like having a hospital in your town or having your child sent to school. Second point here, infrastructure. I think it's the second. Infrastructure is has a decreasing return of investment, and it is a reason for which people don't really love it. Why is that? Because it depreciates very quickly. In 5 years, there will be another area that built a new research facility that completely overtakes you, or a new bridge that is significantly better than yours. So it's a losing game at best. But secondly, physically, because it is physical infrastructure as opposed to, like educational infrastructure, it starts to crumble, right? It breaks, you need to rebuild it. As opposed to that, the people investment is a significantly longer term. Why is that? Because if they gather skills, they become more productive, they can pay taxes. They generate incentive, natural, not artificial incentive for corporations to move in this area. They reinvest in their family. They buy a house there, they buy a car, they generally lift the economic situation of the region. I'm happy to take CG if not OG.
Right, so you said that people should have the right to move out. So in your world, there's areas that still have bad infrastructure, but with educated people who then move to the main city anyway and leave the poor people behind.
Yeah, no. So if you empower people, some of them will choose to stay because they have community bonds, they care about the area, they're connected with the environment. Some might choose to go, but the crucial point is that you give them some agency. Last point, infrastructure, at best, Gulf case scenario, leads to gentrification. Why is that? You uplift the neighborhood, the prices rise, rich people come in, buy the houses of like people that used to live there and outprice them. See the LA districts who have been invested in infrastructure, and like Black people were completely shut out, so they were never able to benefit from whatever OG is trying to give them. or you have to artificially maintain it relevant for the companies. Lastly, in terms of political impacts, I think the more wealthy, then the more educated they get, they can focus on non-essential needs, such as voting. They trust that the government actually can represent them. They are in the in-group. They have a job, which means they're interested in tax laws or labor unions, which means that they see a potential of evolution and they have an urgency to vote. Moreover, given that there is natural and organic growth because you invested in people, the area becomes electorally relevant, which means that it's not dependent on majority perception, but they become electorally relevant for the politicians, bigger chances of representation.
I thank the speaker very much for the fine speech. I'd like to give the floor to the Deputy Prime Minister to round up opening government's case in today's debate. Hear, hear.
Hi, can I be seen and heard? Okay,
Yep.
I take POIs through the chat exclusively. Both types of investment have their benefits, but we get far more total investment on our side for 3 reasons, which allows us to co-opt the majority of ops benefits, regardless of the chicken or egg problem. 1, it is easier to justify capital-based investments to the broader electorate. Politicians can highlight the nationwide benefits, which may come from more efficient infrastructure and can appeal to the collective impacts of place-based living. Especially if you believe people in urban cities have more political power, can also influence the vote and what policies end up being created. This means that our arguments supersede their claim. That empowers cross-cutting support for this sort of investment in parliamentary coalitions, which means that on net investments vastly increase, especially in these rural and less developed areas. Second, Naomi explains how we get better long-term development by attracting FDI through reducing transportation costs, incredibly signaling that these areas are going to be profitable to invest in, which in the long run rolls in more and more companies where governments don't need to actually hand out cash for them to want to come in. Since we improve the long run and long-term development, we increase the total size of the economic pie. So higher tax revenues allow us to spend more on the welfare and social programs that OP wants to talk about. So even if you believe that we don't start off with that, ultimately, those people are also going to be massively benefited. Thirdly, countries can borrow sovereign debt at more favorable rates when they signal to international creditors and monetary authorities that they are committed fiscal responsibility by investing into productive projects and not social programs. Hence, investing into infrastructure makes international borrowing also cheaper, which allows for governments to spend more money on the whole on our side and improve the lives of individuals. What is the benefit of this? Firstly, it shows that we escape the chicken and egg problem that opposition is really reliant on. We can prove that we get more investments on net, we widen the slice of the pie, so we don't care which one comes first, because ultimately more people are going to be saved and benefit on our side. But here are the 3 reasons why on our side exclusively you get all of the benefits, many of which I don't think are properly responded to by OO. 1, this is additional, by the way, which is if you can have a larger capital and tax revenue base, you can insulate the country in the area from economic crises, which is often the most detrimental to people in those areas because they're likely the first ones to get laid off or to get hard by a lot of different types of crises, including things like climate change. But second, when you have these investments, you have to employ more people. Yes, maybe you will import like the scientist or the inventor of like the solar panel, but guess what? You probably find it cheaper to employ people there to assemble those solar panels and install them because those people are probably cheaper in labor costs compared to importing people. Thirdly, you also have like spare capital to achieve more innovation on our side with actively compounds and growth, which is probably a good thing. What are the other responses then to the entirety of the op case then? 1, they claim that as a rural area, you're always going to be left behind and you will be outcompeted by cities. So you really need to amp up current social welfare programs or human-based investments. Right. Even if governments pour in huge amounts of money, it is highly unlikely that in 20 years, Nagaland will be as competitive as Delhi. It doesn't matter how much money you pour in. The reality is the head start that some of these areas have gotten is already way too significant for other countries to catch up. That means that it is not to say we don't care about these individuals being there, but instead, the perception of education in these areas is already relatively low. Because even if you think you sit through 12 years of education, you are going to work in the same factory anyway, which is why you need the infrastructure to come first for individuals to see an outlet as to where their education is going. On our side of the house, you built that outlet. You show individuals, here's what you can do with an education versus on their side, you don't. Second, they claim that the development doesn't actually help poor people because their skill levels don't match, i.e. Nigerians don't end up buying solar panels. 1, the majority of people assemble these solar panels. You don't need the whole population to be inventing efficient green energy conversion conductors. And also, you don't only sell your solar panels locally, you can sell them globally. That's what globalization is for. And also, you have things like government and corporations end up buying these useful inventions. It's not just like your average citizen like who has a house who wants to install it. This is hugely nonsensical. Third claim then, they claim that it is probably good that you have more immediate relief and it is better for the lives of people compared to like projects that are more infrastructural based and have less like concentrated benefits on people. One, on both sides, there's still a baseline to support immediate welfare causes. Why is this the case? Because often it is a very proximate voting issue. There's huge political pressure. If your children can never be going, if they can never go to school, if your parents are constantly laid off and you don't have enough money to put food on the table and you don't have housing, these are immediate needs that individuals need to care about and will hence also vote about. Generally, also, a country can't have its population without homes or food or money to survive. That's massively calamitous. It is highly unlikely governments will leave people to die on the streets. The upshot is that people are going to be left suffering with no support in the short run. But here's the change. We have it much, much better in the long run, ends up saving more people. One, you create the necessary infrastructure that builds on itself, that generates revenue on itself versus for things like welfare payments or like educational investments. You are constantly playing catch up. You need to constantly be paying people out for them to maintain their livelihoods. You are not creating jobs in this process, but you are alleviating the harms and the impact of job loss. This is on net a social disutility compared to on our side, where it's socially compoundable and it's socially utile. But second, Naomi explained very clearly how you increase that level of investment. But thirdly, this widens the pie of the tax revenue as well. That can go into making things like welfare payments, job skill retraining programs, and job programs in general. So we get both sorts of investments far better on our side of the house. Thirdly, then, here's why you weigh the long run more, even if you buy that we harm people in the short run. Two reasons. Firstly, more people are numerically affected in the long run. There's no reason to believe that the lives of people living today are worth any more than those 10 to 20 years down the road, given they are probably also alive right now. Second, given place-based investments are harder to reverse compared to people-based investments, the impacts and benefits are likely more long-term and definite in the future. Because if you build a road, it is much harder to just take the road back compared to one day saying, we're going to cut investment into education. So suddenly all these people don't have like schools. It's far easier on their side to deprive individuals of these rights versus on our side. It is harder. Fourthly, even if you buy none of that, short-term welfare relief isn't as important as op states because alternative actors like NGOs and charities and religious organizations come in, versus infrastructure requires collective action that only governments and large-scale organizations can do. I'll take a POI.
Yeah, suppose you run a multinational company and you can either build a factory in downtown Lagos, which is well connected to ports and electricity or whatever, or there's a place in the middle of nowhere, but it's got really good roads. Where would you build it?
Obviously, it's not that you only have good roads and that's why you go in. You eventually need to set up these infrastructure. And also, you can have oversaturation of investments within very specific areas because the prices go up. And individuals need to diversify their company and appeal to different different corporate bases in order to maximize your profit. Lastly, then, let's talk about corruption and bloated spending as what Theo wants to POI. Firstly, then, we argue that even though corruption is possible, it is unlikely to be a huge problem on our side. There are strong anti-corruption disincentives. Politicians are afraid of being demonized by their opposition as wasteful. Media and investigative journalists can expose their corruption even though the justice system is not perfect. But also, corporations likely act as anti-corruption watchdogs on our side. Once the government signals its support for building infrastructure and the like, companies have huge economic interest for that infrastructure to be built properly, on budget and on time, because that infrastructure will directly ensure the bidding process for these projects is competitive. Corruption is actually worse on their side when it is hard to quantify and hard to point out, which they need to deal in the comparative and in Naomi's response. But lastly, even if you don't believe any of this, we say the harm of corruption is outweighed by widening the pie of government revenue. And on our side of the house, even if you have like 10% corruption, you have 60% more investment. That's on that a good.
I thank the speaker very much for that speech. I'd like to give the floor to the Deputy Leader of Opposition to round up their case in today's debate. Here.
Hello, am I audible, visible, all good?
Yep.
Look. Asgard is not a place. It never was. Asgard is our people. So when you invest in land, when you invest in a region, I think that you forget about the people. That's why the zero interaction with our gentrification point loses OG the debate. Firstly, I want to do some weighing at the beginning of the speech because our point on politics is actually quite relevant. They fail to interact with it. Note, what should you care about in this debate? Is it the momentary investment today and for the next 2 years, or is it constant reinvestment throughout time? Because obviously you should care about constant reinvestment investment. One, because it's like more in time and there's more money invested there, but also secondarily because a region doesn't stay rich by just existing based on what happened in the past, but by constantly reinvesting in itself, as we said on LO. So where do you get constant reinvestment? When you can convince the politicians that it is valuable to invest in the regions, thus when you have political capital. And political capital can only be accessed by people when they have, one, enough education for them to know who to vote on and to know that voting is important. I think that this is a precondition for you to be able to access your voting rights and any political capital, and then to further access any investment in the future. Education is provided by opposition side, thus more political capital for this downtrodden region. Secondarily, I think that you get it when you actually are involved in politics, when you care about it. Again, something that can only happen when you have a certain level of income and a certain level of education. Thirdly, I think that you need politicians to cater and care for you. And this again happens when these people can assure them votes or they can assure them money. This cannot happen when this region is extremely poor and the people have no access. And note, when you invest into infrastructure, the people don't magically become rich and powerful and involved in politics. They do when you invest in the way that we want to invest on opposition. That shows you that constant reinvestment can only happen when we invest in these people. So even if short term, like maybe the next 5 years, like OG builds more bridges, I don't care, because it's more likely that we can get more reinvestment as we gain political capital, and we aren't dependent on the people in the cities telling us whether we should or should not receive money. And here OG tries to squirrel this by saying, but we get welfare anyway because it's a voting issue. If these people don't vote, it's not a voting issue and nobody cares about it. Huge point that loses OG the debate because it trickles down into time. Now, some further responses. Firstly, they try on DPM to say that they get more, like the size of the pie is bigger because they get more investment. Firstly, because it's easier to justify the investment. If you have political capital, you have less of a need to justify that investment. But secondarily, the other points on FDI and sovereign debt don't really mean much because they just prove that the country can get richer. But unless they are able to prove distribution of wealth, their point doesn't matter. Note, this motion applies within the state on different regions. That means extremely poor regions within the US. That means rural regions in Eastern Europe, in Romania or Bulgaria or wherever you want, right? The issue with this is that most countries are actually quite rich and the cities are doing really well. It is the rural areas who don't get access to resources. They never manage to prove distribution. We do by showing you why people get access to education. And if CG wants to say that they move to the cities, fine. Some people move to the cities and have a better quality of life. I think that this is a net good. Moreover, they try to argue that infrastructure is necessary in order to access benefits. Firstly, I think that public goods aren't automatically free because you can't just give free things to people. You need to put some barriers of entry for them. Either not all people can access it at the same time, which is the case for healthcare. There are only so many hospital beds, or you price them out by forcing them to pay for said public good, such as how you pay for your electricity bill or water. That means that these public goods need to be paid for. If the people in the region don't have money in order for them to pay for the infrastructure, they can't access it. Thus, the chicken and egg problem loses on OG because they don't have the money to access all of the infrastructure that they want to access. Moreover, I think that the issue here is that OG never manages to prove that for these people, they are willing to invest these resources into paying for healthcare, for example. Because note, I might build the hospital and it might be really good that I build the hospital. But if people in the rural area are struggling to find enough money to eat, I think that they will deprioritize their healthcare, thus not access all of the benefits on OG. So at the end of this, I think that it's very likely that you are unable to access infrastructure. And even if you give them the basics, the ability of people to access them and who access them changes because people are likely to be gentrified from their region. If they want to play on attracting investment and foreign direct investment and lots of money pouring in, I think that a lot of rich people are going to come in. And even if you are able to access like basic goods, you're no longer able to access shops because all shops are now built for rich people. You're no longer able to access rent because now people realize they can price you out by having really high rent because other people are coming into the region and getting you out. Thus, you likely need to move to an even poorer region. At the end of this, infrastructure might be necessary, but only after people have a certain level basic of income so they can actively engage with this infrastructure. Because OG doesn't manage to prove this and CG also cannot prove this, I think that they lose the debate. Before I move on, I can take CG.
Right. So in your world, investing into education and healthcare looks like what exactly, if not building hospitals?
Investing into people looks like reskilling. This is an important part. And here I'm also interacting with OG. When OG says that education is unnecessary because somebody that on their own frame cannot access running water but has internet and electricity, I think that education is important because it means that you go from agriculture to manufacturing. People aren't born knowing how to build robots or make t-shirts or whatever. They need to be skilled in order to do that. Reskilling, which is a type of education, is likely going to lead to you being able to have better people working better jobs. This also deals with the point on FDI, because I don't think companies come in order for them to make money off the roads you build. They can build their own roads. They come here because the labor is so cheap that they can better access it and they can have better prices. So when you provide people with better working, like with better workers who are more skilled, more companies are going to want to invest into you. So what do you have at the end of this debate? One, in order for infrastructure impacts to accrue, they need the basic level of income that we provide on our side of the house. Secondarily, I think that even if all we manage to prove is that people are more skilled and they can move to the city in order for them to access more money, I think that this is a benefit, one, because we better care about the people, but also secondarily because that money can then be reinvested into that region by people sending money home to their relatives. I think that this wins on all.
Great. I thank very much for that speaker for that speech. I'd like to call upon the extension speaker from site Closing Government to open their site in today's debate. Here. CG, are you here?
Yeah, sorry, just organizing notes. Cool. You guys in the chat, please. And starting in 3, 2, 1. Firstly, extraneous responses to OO, and then multiple smaller extension where we fill out the analytical gaps of OG. The first thing that OO says is extra education to compete with urban populations. I think this is where they kind of concede to us our own brain drain point, right? Because if they say that you need this extra investment into reskilling to be able to compete with urban populations, then that's exactly the point at which, according to the best case scenario of their case, you have the sufficient ability to move into the city and get a much better paying job there. I will later explain why this is bad, but here we're taking them at their best, and we're going to still show why under this burden that we're taking, we can beat them. I think that in that case, if you get maybe slightly subpar skills to the urban populations, better infrastructure in your local area, you still are able to use those skills within the context of your local competition, but you're more likely to stay there, which is likely to be better. The second thing that they tell us is that it's very difficult to build infrastructure because it takes a long time and it's a long time to accrue all of the benefits. Firstly, I think it also takes a long time to accrue the benefits of education, for the fact that you need to wait a lot of time for kids to actually grow up and get all the benefits from schooling. Secondly, though, I'm not sure this is the case. I'm not sure this is exclusive insofar as their site might still do things like, I don't know, build schools and whatnot. But thirdly, I'm also not sure why it's the case that infrastructure takes that long to build beyond assertion. Look, for example, at China, which is able to build a massive bridge in 48 hours because it has the expertise to do that. The last thing that they say is that technology depreciates, or a few things that they say technology depreciates quickly, but I think things like skills can also depreciate as long as they're not properly honed. And then the things about gentrification are not mutually exclusive, because if you have enough education and in their best case stay in the city and then become more affluent, then you still drive up demand and drive up prices. So I'm not sure why this is exclusive. And the last point about FDI, where they're we get more FDI once we have an educated populations and MNCs will build the infrastructure. Just intuitively, right? As an MNC, it's a lot of fucking risk to build something for a long period of time, right? And it might not working out, this long-term investment. Whereas it's not that big of a risk to educate the workers, because you can get that quicker if you're doing specific education for that specific job, i.e. that specific manufacturing. So when we supply them with the precondition of infrastructure, that's when they're more likely to come. And this also, defends OG. First extension then on brain drain. How does brain training? I've already mechanized how brain training happens. OO gives one response when we POI this. They have plenty of time to respond. They say, but you have ties to your community. Untrue. Two structural reasons. Firstly, things like education literally change your identity and how you associate yourself, right? And moving into other higher educated classes is likely to mean that those are people that you relate with more and people that you feel with more. Therefore, this community tie can very easily be broken. Secondly, though, people are just naturally self-interested and chase money and chase the places where they can get the largest benefits. You know that you can actually see this in practice. Like The Economist recently had an interview with Nigerians in Lagos who are lying to their families from the neighboring villages about their incomes because they don't want their families to constantly ask them for money because they want to keep the money for themselves. This is something that people just do. Why is this a bad thing? Because A, you increase inequality between urban areas, like suburban areas and urban areas, which means that it's tough to get funding in the future because more and more influential people move into those larger cities, and it's the larger cities who are donating you money basically when you build this through taxes, right, to the smaller impoverished areas. And so the people there don't want to use their tax money constantly to give it to those other impoverished areas, which you don't even see developing because all of the people who get it come into the large cities anyway. But secondly, you leave the most vulnerable behind. The grandmas who can access this, the people who for whatever reason cannot get access to this education, who do not have the choice to move out, those are there without a proper support system. Comparatively, we create a more sustainable base with the ability to create long-term tax revenue and whatnot. Second extension about why we actually get more money allocated to projects on our side. And since OG runs this, I think they do a bad thing. 4 reasons as to why we get more money actually to physical infrastructure than to people infrastructure. Firstly, because you see the stuff that is built and you see this every day when you walk around it, when you walk across that river where you couldn't have before, which means that it ingrains in your mind and the visibility is omnipresent and constantly bombards you. Secondly, things like political showmanship. Politicians love to cut ribbons in front of large buildings and love the success that this brings, which means there's more political willingness to invest money into this. Thirdly, the current wave of hype for green infrastructure and green technology. OG only says that you can secure loans better for infrastructure, but this is the nuance. The IMF and the World Bank are now having conditions that are specific on you actually having green infrastructure and green investments with what you're doing, which is why you get cheap loans from them on our side. This is where we mech this out better than OG. Also, the fact that we just have more political willingness because green stuff is popular. Lastly, you get overall spillover benefits for the entire country from things like basic research. OG says the whole country benefits from infrastructure. I'm not sure why, but basic research literally benefits everyone because anyone can then use that research. Right? So this is also why the entire country supports this more. Before I continue,
If the population of the area gets more wealthy, they won't outprice themselves out of their own home. Increase of political capital and ability to access development
no, look, your grandma who can't access the education doesn't get more wealthy. Come on. Okay, why is this important? Because then irrespective of which is like more effective, the fact that we get more resources for ours on our side means that we can bypass this clash and still be able to beat on this, and we're not hinged on the same stuff that OG is hinged on. Lastly, why is infrastructure likely to be good? Because this is of good quality, because this is something that OG struggles with regards to OO. Firstly, because there's currently a massive amount of awareness because of failed projects in the past, things like BRI and whatnot. People are scared, but also the US is actively like running propaganda to make sure that you check out all of your infrastructure projects, that they're actually correct, so that this doesn't happen again. But secondly, because it's the politicians' legacy to see how well this bridge will actually work, and therefore they really care to make sure that this works well because they have high egos. This means you do things like maybe independent bodies that assess this, calculate your budgets properly, make sure that everything runs on time. But also note that all of the stuff that O talks about is exclusive to like massive projects like railways across entire continents or countries. These are smaller scale things in underdeveloped areas, which means we're just more likely to get it correct because we don't suffer the same issues that we do with mega projects. For all of those reasons, CG.
I thank the speaker very much for those remarks. I'd like to invite the extension speaker from side closing opposition to open their side in today's debate. Here. CO, are you here?
Yes,
Yep.
yes, we are. I think I'm audible. Your eyes in the Zoom chat, please. Two things on closing opposition. Firstly, why the private sector is going to provide physical-based investment already, independently of the government, and is not going to do this with people-based investment. Secondly, why people-based investment is more useful, but before that, a bunch of rebuttal. Starting with opening government, I think there's two broad claims coming from opening government. The first is a silly chicken and egg problem, where apparently if you don't have the best infrastructure, you're unable to have schools and hospitals. I think there's two observations we'd like to make against this. The first part of this is there is some scale to the quality of the physical infrastructure that already exists. Even if you don't have the best roads within your area, you might still have gravel roads or dirt roads that you can travel along to access schools. In fact, schools are probably built in villages where most people live. You are able to access these things without the best physical infrastructure that they want to provide. The second thing here is we're going to explain in extension why the private sector is oftentimes going to provide this independently of the government, and therefore the chicken and egg problem is not a real one in this debate. The second and main thing that we get from opening government is this idea then that you're going to get more investment. And this more additional investment doesn't come from the government itself, because the government has finite constraints on the amount of money that they have, but rather from the private sector and FDI and other countries and companies and those sorts of situations. The important thing to observe here is the motion is not about approaches that you take for the country in general, but specifically approaches that you take for just the underdeveloped areas of the country, as we allude to in a POI. This is important because, as we point out, FDI is never going to be directed towards rural Nigeria or to really underdeveloped parts of countries just because you've built like flashy new roads in those kind of areas. They're still going to be a lot less attractive than the urban centres or even the second and third tier cities within the country where you have more labour, more access to infrastructure and global markets and so on. That means then that opening government doesn't actually make a difference when it comes to additional foreign investment, since that is never really going to the underdeveloped areas in the first place, and all of their flow-on impacts like more job creation, tax revenue, etc., don't stand it around. Moving on then to closing government, I just want to rebut one main claim coming from closing government, which is that you get a lot of hype associated with big projects, which is going to be useful. I think this is actually actively harmful. Insofar that CG runs this analysis, they concede that the majority of funding is going to go towards really flashy big projects that the government is currying favor towards, maybe because it looks good politically, or you're able to have a photo op or whatever as a result, or politicians are obsessed with their legacies and so on. I think these big projects are really harmful because oftentimes they're not the most efficient. You're not necessarily going to be successful and built in the first place. And if you're putting money towards these things, you're not putting money towards the small changes that are more likely to make a tangible difference in the lives of individuals. First substantive then on why the private sector provides these physical kinds of services, however not people-based services independent of the government. Why is this the case? I think the central idea here is that you are able to charge for physical infrastructure, and therefore the private sector is going to provide it, if not already, in a way that you're unable to do so for people-based infrastructure. You can charge people for electricity, therefore private companies are going to build electricity lines to different places and provide versions of electricity through solar panels or like batteries or whatever when there is money to be made. You can charge people to connect to your water services and pay for water, therefore companies are going to set up infrastructure that supplies water to individuals. You can charge people for public transport, train tickets, bus tickets, and so on, and those kinds of connections. Therefore, companies are going to provide that kind of physical infrastructure that allows people to get from place to place. You can charge people to pay for their mobile phones and have access to the internet and so on. Therefore, companies build mobile towers in order to provide mobile services to those people, and therefore, because money is able to be made in those sorts of ways. The reason why this analysis is significant is it shows that when it comes to a lot of these things, like electricity, water, transport, mobile service, etc. There is no need for the government to be investing in these kind of things because the private sector has the active financial incentive to do so, and they're therefore likely to be doing so already, and if not, they're going to do so in the future. In contrast, we think there is a severe under-provision of people-based services because you aren't able to charge for them in exactly the same sort of ways. The first reason for this is just because the benefits of providing education accrue not just to the person who's being educated, but rather a broader group of society at large. It accrues to the employer who now has a more productive worker. It accrues to the government who is now able to have more tax revenue and so on. And those kinds of benefits aren't like calculated when an individual is deciding if they want to pay for education or not. It's also harder to assess the quality of this because you're not paying for a tangible service, and oftentimes it's seen as a public good and therefore people are unwilling to pay for that. The significance of all of this analysis under this first heading then is that absent the government, these physical services are going to be provided. However, people-based services are not, and therefore the government ought to do that in the most underdeveloped areas. Before I move on, opening government.
There's no reason for a single firm to open up concrete roads and railways because the upfront cost is huge and your competitors use it for free. You need governments to intervene in order for firms to be willing to invest in these services that follow it.
Yeah, cool. I don't think these roads have to be super expensive, right? There's a scale to this. You can improve the roads in the area. You can like build electricity lines that only your company is able to use. You can build like a railway network that you own, as happens in many sorts of places. Second extension then on why people-based investments are the most useful. Vice transfer this. The first part of this is that when you give people information about the jobs that they do, you raise productivity, which measurably improves their lives. So if you give skills training to a farmer to tell them what kinds of crops to grow in what times of years and how to do this in the most efficient ways, then they're able to grow more crops and feed their family better. The second part of this is that people are now just going to be more able to innovate. Where you give people education and the ability to like create new technologies through mobile phones or whatever, they're able to create technologies that maybe let the farmer knows how much he's going to be paid before he goes to the market and then make an informed decision about whether he does that. The third part of this is that as economies transition towards more service-based economies, you do need some amount of literacy and numeracy in order to function. Because jobs, people aren't just like completely repetitive manufacturing jobs. Those are automated because that is cheaper to do so. There's still some amount of literacy and numeracy that's necessary in order to be paid. Fourthly, I think there's non-economic liberation of individuals as well. For example, when women get more educated, they're less likely to be like teen mums or whatever, and like access liberation, those kinds of ways. And finally, I think that when it comes to enabling people to migrate, this is actively a good thing because it allows, it upholds the agency of individuals to do what they think is most useful for their lives. It allows them to make more money and also get those benefits back to their local communities. I think at Closing Opposition, we give you the strongest explanation of why people-based investment is the most useful and why it is uniquely needed in these kinds of situations. We're very proud to oppose.
I thank that speaker very much for the fine speech. Guys, you're cutting off a bit. I was able to track everything. It was just these small moments where you robotized. So maybe you should check your internet and stuff like that. Yeah.
I'll make sure to speak really quickly.
Fair enough. Okay, I thank very much that speaker. With that said, I'd like to give the floor to the GovWhip to end the government mentioned today's debate. Here.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yep.
Cool. Okay, beginning in 3, 2, 1, go. First, know why private companies are likely to do the things that CEO wants to talk about anyway. I think first, because you can provide educational that is conditional on people signing longer-term contracts with you. I think specifically what this looks like is stuff like building schools within like specific areas, like outsourcing that to other companies. But I think too, education and health aren't unifaceted, right? I think there are different aspects of education and health that often have low barriers for entry. I think what this specifically looks like is giving companies like allowing companies or outsourcing training on a particular machine to other companies. I think too, a lot of these are low risk, right? If CO and O are correct, that they take long term and they have high risk, I think at the point at which you're able to do stuff like just training people on individual machines means that the government often has an incentive to give these to private companies anyway. Like more on this later, right? But I think first thing on the time frame argument that comes out like opening opposition. I think in order for education and health to be effective, you need to have a knowledge base that you build up over years of school children doing it, or like people buying into the healthcare system, thereby like getting the healthcare system in the first place. I think specifically what this looks like is that means that you need generational levels of data in order for you to actually get optimal outcomes for like education and health and like optimizing the systems in the first place. But I think even if that's not the case, let's engage with like their response to us, because I think O says that the long time frame means that people constantly suffer. I think this is worse on their side for a few reasons. I think A, because deprioritizing investment means that the place of these things is secondary on your agenda. I think 2, you have a limited sum. If there's an issue of prioritization, you have a singular budget by which you allocate either towards like this people-based investment or this place-based investment. I think specifically when you have that limited sum and you prioritize one piece of investment over another, you no longer like get this form of infrastructural investment, which means that the time frame is a lot longer on their side of the house. But I think 3, when this competition exists, you lack the incentive to do this in the first place. I think the incentive here is that if O's analysis is that people suffer because of a lot of this infrastructure, they're much more likely to suffer for a much longer period on their side of the house because you lack the incentive to do any of this infrastructure in the first place. The way they try to sidestep this is by saying that people have agency. I want to note that this agency argument is uncertain for a few reasons. I think A, because people buy into the upside education and healthcare stuff in many different ways. There are a few reasons for this. I think A, because there's just generally historical issues that a lot of communities have with like a lot of these things. For example, the Black community not buying into like the healthcare system in the United States of America. 2, there's likely to be a government norm, right? I think when you like, there's a lot of anti-establishment sentiment within a lot of these areas because the government has systematically fucked them over, stuff like that. I think 3, a lot of these things are newer concepts. I think individuals on the ground aren't like familiar with stuff like reskilling or familiar with stuff like skill programs. I think at the point at which it's a new thing that you're introducing in these societies, people are less likely to buy into that because this is less proximal and stuff like building a road and stuff like that. But I think 4, and I think this is really important, people have different needs when it comes to education and healthcare. Because I think in Ops best case, when you get the initial investment, there's constant demand for many different forms of investment because people have different needs when it comes to stuff like healthcare. People have many different diseases, or say a college student has different educational needs than like a school child. I think crucially then, at the point at which people have these different like incentives, communities are unable to coalesce on these issues in a uniform way. What this specifically means is that when many different members of that like a specific community have different needs when it comes to the investment on their side of the house, they're unable to build the communities and coalesce and get all of the political capital that they say on their side of the house. I think the comparative here is crucial because OG says that it's harder to reverse. But I think there are 2 things we'd like to add from CG. I think A, this is differentiated on a much lower level. I think a person like, let's say his name's Wurdan and he's really rich, and a person named Callum who's really poor, they both need roads. This is independent of the differing levels of need that they have in terms of stuff like education and stuff like that. They still both need those roads in order to access the different things that they need in their life. But I think 2, in terms of preference fulfillment, people's access on different levels is something that we're still able to uniformly coalesce on our side of the house when they need these roads in the first place. The weighing here is certainty, right? Because even if the time frame is long, we are certain that we're going to get some level of infrastructure or some level of like investment into this infrastructure. I think on their side of the house specifically, when these different incentives exist, it's uncertain to what extent A, people buy into this in the first place, but 2, you get the returns on the investment that they like to talk about on their side of the house. Then secondly, on political capital, because they say that like the political incentives of people are likely to change when they get education. I want to know, just like if you check your flow, they don't necessarily prove why, this like skills leads to knowledge or education leads to knowledge, apart from just saying that. I think the political incentives are unlikely to diverge in a meaningful way on their side of the house. Why? I think A, because people just generally care about the material conditions that they have more than the soft skills that they derive from these material conditions. The reason for this is that these roads or like infrastructure or the place that you live in is the most proximal like thing to you as an individual. It's the first thing that you access when you're a kid. When you're born, you see that you're in these shitty conditions. People care a lot more about that than any of the soft skills or education that they get on their side of the house. What I think this means crucially is that you build a lot of these communities and get a lot more political capital on our side of the house. But I think 2, and really importantly, your ability to coalesce as a community is based on finding a lowest common denominator by which you present yourself as a community, right? I think at that point, you default to the initial preference that I just talked about in terms of wanting your like your land to be better or your roads to be better in order for you to access any of the soft skills that they talk about. This is also proof for all of the opening government mechanisms, right? Because the only thing that OG says is that there's a precondition for getting all of these soft skills. The crucial thing here is that people are able to coalesce with these communities and then access those things. If they do want to access these things, I'm uncertain if they do on opening government. But But I think 3, the disparities that exist between the ruling class in these communities is really large anyway. I'm unsure to what extent this education will lead to a bridging of this gap on opening up this issue. Before I move on, I'll take the
Not worrying about food, having interest in tax or labor laws, and becoming electorally relevant is the surest way to have your infrastructure rebuilt and not just built once and then forgotten. This is a precursor to accessing all of your more investment.
So I think there are many different types of people that exist within these communities. I'm unsure for like an illiterate poor person why they care much more about education than going to work on a daily basis. I'm unsure why even people within the middle of that chain care about getting any, like if they have a base level of education, they want to be able to exploit that base level of education. Anyway, on the way up against OG, I think our extension like means that you're unable to like OG says you need place-based access to access people's-based access. I think our extension means that you don't access either in the worst case, because Naomi says some people are able to move, but Alex adds an incentive structure, but I think 2, in order to leave, you only need to leave once, which means that there already exists infrastructure to do so. The value here is that it's not contingent on what comes first. The LO response on deadlock works in opening government. We're able to sidestep this. But I think 2, we have a preservation of a base for people to access either, because in OG's best case, it comes first and people that need it are able to access it higher on scale. On our side of the house, people of many different classes are able to access this. When people then migrate, you leave the systemic inequality that exists between the ruling class and these poor people. On our side of the house, we get this difference apart. We clearly went from CG. I beg you to.
I thank very much that speaker for that fine speech. I'd like to give the floor to the Opwhip to end today's debate. Here.
Hello, I'm just checking audible.
Yep, you're audible. Yeah.
So, I'll start by answering both of closing government's extensions, because both of them are really just material for op bench. The first thing they say is like, oh no, you get a brain drain because people move to where they get better jobs. The first thing is, I'm not really sure if that's a particularly bad thing. Like, giving them an education gives them the agency to allow them to do things such as make the best of their life. And it's not like once they leave, they suddenly hate their whole family, right? Like, there's a very widespread phenomenon of people who move to the cities and stay, for instance, married to the same family that lives back in their rural hometown, and they come back every now and then, every year, they send a lot of money back. This just sounds like we're enriching people. That's pretty good. But the second thing we'd notice is this is just a generally alarming point that says you should not educate poor people, because what if they moved away from the area in which they are? So even if GovBench had the budget to educate people and to provide them with infrastructure, closing government's extension is like, well, we probably still shouldn't educate them, which I think should probably, ring some alarm bells. Alarm bells which indicate their extension isn't barking up the right tree. The second thing they say is like, you get more money allocated, basically because politicians can make a big deal about big new shiny infrastructure they can do. The issue is that this shows that it's significantly in the interest of politicians to spend money on really stupid things. It means that you're going to spend money on a huge bridge of shining concrete instead of on the necessary network of unflashy roads that are efficient at allowing people to access services in their backwater towns. It means you spend money on a high-speed rail that goes straight to the capital because that's what gets you votes, rather than building a slow freight line to a port that would allow you to be able to export agricultural goods. It means that you build an enormous power station rather than, for instance, allowing people to build rooftop solar things in a far more decentralized way that's actually far better for their interests. So if anything, not only does this wipe out CG, it also puts a huge dividend OG's case, where they're like, well, these things that can be done. Electoral incentives are to do this in a particular way that, just benefits, that just like looks really flashy, that causes a huge amount of money to sort of like go into their own pockets. And so it's likely this isn't done very well. So CG at this point is on negative points. At this point, I'll bring in our extension to beat them by a larger margin, but also deal with the rest of the teams. Our first extension was about how basically the private sector is likely to fill in the gaps on our side, but not on government bench, because the private sector is likely to provide place-based stuff anyway. Opening government in a POI says, why would you build a railway? It takes ages to get your money back. This applies to funding of any infrastructure program. They're financed with loans because you take a big loan and pay it back in installments because you get your payments in little installments so you can meet those loan obligations. That applies to government-built infrastructure anyway. The second thing they say in the POI is that why would you build it if your competition can use it? It's not like you build the railway and suddenly they're all running trains over it against your will, right? You charge them to do that, and so you earn a healthy profit. This means that they can make profits by running these services. And this applies to things like, for instance, building sewage networks where you pay to connect your house to a network. It applies to, for instance, like the cell phone towers that are already existent and so on. But this critically doesn't apply to things like education and health, because the benefits of those accrue to all of society. All of society benefits from people being educated. All of society benefits from people having better health and so on. The thing is, and closing government response to this being like, well, corporations, I don't know, there's some response. Which is like, well, corporations can charge for health or education or whatever. The issue is that competition in these cases is really bad because per opening government's analysis, it's really hard to assess how effective a particular education program is, how effective a particular health thing is, which means that that's why the government should provide it, because the government incentives to provide a baseline things, they have long-term interest, whereas these corporations can provide worse things. The other thing that closing government says is it's like, well, companies can train people on the condition that they then work for that company. Congratulations, you've dealt with 1/3 of the examples in the motion. What about the other 2/3? But I don't think they even deal with that 1/3 because they don't explain at all why these companies would go to an area where they have to pay people on these weird contracts that are likely not enforceable in the local courts that are probably already backlogged, when they could just go to a place where they can hire workers that are already trained. So that's why they don't get ahead. And this is critical because this means that if the government doesn't spend on infrastructure, it's likely that the infrastructure is going to get built anyway, maybe not as perfectly as government wants, but still, you're going to have passable stuff. Whereas on our side, we would point out that whereas on their side, you're not going to get really good things like education. You're not going to have things like nurses going around and inoculating people against diseases. And that feeds into the second part of our extension, which is just how important it is to have things like education and health in order to raise productivity. Because CG has some responses. They're like, well, people mistrust the government, they won't engage. But the thing is, like, most will. Like, most people do actually have a high opinion of education. Most people do value that. Most people do want a good future for their children. Then they're like, well, some people have different needs. Same applies to infrastructure. That's symmetric. Before moving on, I'll take closing gov.
Look,
opening gov. Oh, sorry, closing. Go ahead.
Look. The thing is that you can make an employee sign a contract to work with you for 2 years, and then you educate them on how to work with a certain machine. That's why you get education from private sectors too.
2 years, right? Like that's not a great deal. Like anyway. Second extension was about.
You cut off. When you hear
so, just like it's so easy.
Is it only me who's hearing the cutting off? Hi. You cut off very badly. Okay. Yeah. So I stopped at 5:30. The last thing which I heard was this is not a very good deal.
Okay.
When responding to the POI, so you have 1 minute and 30 seconds more.
Are you able to turn off video just because that might be better? Am I stuttering still, or is this better?
Just a bit, but you're both of you are stuttering a bit. It's fine. If you stutter a lot, I'll stop again. Yep.
Okay. Thank you for that. I'll resume now, I guess. So a subsistence farmer who is literate and numerate is far better able to use services to access information about what crops to plant and hence potentially earn way more money than otherwise. They're better able to time when they go to markets, they can get better prices for their crops. They're better able to time, for instance, when to apply fertilizer or when to, harvest things due to better weather forecasts. They're better able to manage budgets such that they can save up money. They're better able to, for instance, manage irrigation. All of these things offer them far, far bigger returns on investment than simply having faster roads by which they can transport things to market. But also would note these benefits apply from health. For instance, providing people with antibiotics to treat chronic illnesses. For instance, vaccinating people. and so on. And all of this is far more important than having faster roads or building factories, which might give you dangerous and exhausting jobs, and clearly outweighs opening opposition's material about things like gentrification or their somewhat tortured electoral mechanism. These are all things that are really obvious and substantial benefits to people on the ground. Finally, some quick responses to opening government. They say infrastructure is a necessary condition for everything. One, Andrew noted they already have some infrastructure. You can still get goods to market. It just might be a little bit faster on side government. But second of all, our first extension answered this because the private sector is likely to provide this where it is lacking anyway. But third of all, our second extension answered this because far more effective ways to increase yields are those that exist on our side. And then when they say people get jobs and stuff, first of all, this doesn't increase aggregate demand. This just shuffles around, like they're all just competing for the same demand. But second of all, these regions still have drawbacks. For instance, they're politically unstable and isolated. I promise there's way more rebuttal, but anyway, proud to oppose.
Great. Thank you very much for that fine speech, everyone, for a very wonderful debate. You can virtually shake hands, make friends. This is a closed